There are places in America that feel as though they're protected by time itself. Small towns, tucked away from the noise of the world, where the community fabric is woven from generations of trust. Dale, Indiana, was one of those places. A town of just 1,500 souls nestled in the rolling hills of Spencer County, where a sense of safety wasn't just an assumption, it was a way of life. It was the kind of town where neighbors waved from their porches, where kids rode their bikes until dusk, and where the unspoken rule was to always look out for one another. But on a quiet summer morning in 2001, a single knock on a door would prove that evil doesn't need an invitation to the big city. Sometimes it comes looking for you, with a friendly smile and a simple lie. Before this case became a 2-decade legal battle, before her name was etched into court documents and news archives, there was just Stacy. Stacy Lynn Payne was a vibrant, brilliant force of life. At 15, on the verge of her sophomore year at Heritage Hills High School, she had already built a life full of promise and joy. She was a consistent honor roll student, a cheerleader whose energy was infectious, a member of the student council who wanted to make a difference, and a talented flutist in the school's marching band. Her mother, Julie, would later remember her as happy and full of life, always lifting everyone up, an extraordinary girl. She loved the song, "You Are My Sunshine," and was saving the money she earned from her part-time job at a local pizza place. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a bright light in a small town. In any just world, her story would have been about the milestones she was yet to reach. Getting her driver's license, graduating high school, her wedding day, and having children of her own. But Stacy's story was stolen from her. And to understand the depth of that theft, we must first remember the brilliant life that was taken. The morning of July 11th, 2001, began with the quiet hum of an ordinary summer day. Inside her family's home, Stacy was getting ready for her shift at Jenks Pizza. Her younger sister, Melissa, was still asleep upstairs, and the rest of the family had already left for their jobs. The house was peaceful, a sanctuary filled with the gentle light of a mid-July morning. And then there was a knock. On the other side of the door stood 29-year-old Roy Lee Ward. He wasn't a menacing stranger who looked out of place. He was just a man with a simple, believable problem. He told Stacy he was looking for his lost dog. It's a scenario that plays on our deepest fears. A predator using a simple, neighborly request as a weapon. We're taught to be kind, to help others. But how do you know when an act of kindness could put you in danger? Have you ever had a moment where your intuition screamed at you, even when everything seemed normal? Share your story in the comments below. In a town like Dale, helping a neighbor look for a lost pet was second nature. It was an act of community, an act of trust. Stacy Payne, a girl described by her own mother as someone who lifted everyone up, was a kind person. She listened to his story, and in that moment, a fatal decision was made, born not of carelessness, but of compassion. She led him inside the house. As the door clicked shut, the quiet rhythm of that summer morning was broken. The safety of the Payne family home was shattered. And upstairs, Stacy's younger sister was about to be woken up by the sounds of her sister's screams. Upstairs, the morning silence had been violently replaced by a sound that would haunt the Payne family forever. Awakened by her sister's screams, 14-year-old Melissa peered from the top of the stairs. The sight below was incomprehensible. A man was on top of Stacy, holding her down. In a moment of terror and astonishing courage, Melissa didn't freeze. She ran to her parents' bedroom, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. Her voice a desperate whisper, ensuring the attacker wouldn't hear. After making the call that would seal her sister's attacker's fate, she hid in a closet, waiting in suffocating silence for help to arrive. The The first to answer that call was Daletown Marshal Matt Keller. As he pulled up to the quiet suburban home, nothing seemed out of place. But as he approached the front door, it opened. Standing in the threshold was Roy Ward, covered in perspiration and still holding a knife. Keller drew his weapon, his voice cutting through the morning air as he ordered Ward to the ground. Ward complied, dropping the weapon and muttering the first of many denials. "I didn't do anything." He was arrested on the spot, just minutes after the attack began, caught literally red-handed. The question of who did this was never in doubt. The question that would haunt investigators, lawyers, and 2 separate juries for the next 24 years was why. Stepping inside, Marshal Keller was confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. The kitchen floor was covered in a massive pool of blood. There, he found Stacy. She was nude from the waist down, her body bearing the evidence of a savage struggle. Her abdomen had been cut open, exposing her intestines. But the most chilling detail was this. Stacy was still conscious. Her eyes were open. She was aware. A deep laceration across her throat had severed her trachea, making it impossible for her to speak, to scream, or to call for help. All she could do was look at her rescuers, her eyes pleading for the help her voice could not summon. When paramedics arrived, they were met with what one seasoned first responder, Jane Stout, would later describe as the most brutal scene she had ever witnessed. As they worked desperately to save her, they noted she was alert, able to respond to their questions by nodding. Stout would later testify that for the entire time they treated her, from the kitchen floor to the back of the ambulance, Stacy was conscious, with tears in her eyes as she struggled for every breath. The fight for her life had just begun. The bravery of first responders, like Marshal Keller and Jane Stout, often goes unseen. They are the ones who walk into our worst nightmares to help. If you have a story about a police officer, paramedic, or firefighter who made a difference in your life or your community, please share it in the comments to honor their service. And if you're able, consider supporting organizations that provide mental health resources for these heroes who carry the weight of scenes like this long after the sirens fade. The trial by fury. The brutal murder of Stacy Payne sent a shockwave of stunned disbelief through the quiet streets of Dale. A town built on a foundation of trust was now grappling with a horror it had only ever seen on the news. The community's grief was immense and immediate. Nearly 200 people gathered for a vigil in Stacy's honor, their candlelight flickering against the summer night, a silent testament to the bright life that had been extinguished. Over 500 mourners attended her funeral. This profound, collective anguish, however, would soon become the central legal obstacle in the path to justice. In October 2002, Roy Lee Ward's trial began in Spencer County. His guilt seemed a foregone conclusion. He was caught at the scene, holding the weapon, with a direct witness in Stacy's own sister. But his defense team argued that the very community demanding justice was the reason he couldn't receive it there. They filed a motion for a change of venue, claiming that the pervasive media coverage and intense public hostility made a fair trial impossible. Local news had been relentless, often including details of Ward's extensive and inadmissible prior criminal history. The atmosphere was so charged that at one pretrial hearing, an angry crowd yelled at Ward as he was escorted through the courthouse. The jury selection process laid the problem bare. Of the 122 potential jurors questioned, more than 80% already knew about the case. Finding 12 impartial citizens in a county so deeply wounded seemed an impossible task. In the end, of the 12 jurors who were seated, 6 admitted they had already formed an opinion about Ward's guilt before hearing a single piece of evidence in court. Despite this, the trial went forward. Ward was found guilty and, on December 18, 2002, sentenced to death. For the Payne family, It was a moment of resolution, a belief that justice, though painful, had been served. But the story was far from over. For 2 years, the case worked its way through the appellate courts until June 30, 2004, when the Indiana Supreme Court delivered a stunning decision. They reversed the conviction. They vacated the death sentence. They ordered a new trial. The ruling had nothing to do with Ward's guilt. It was based entirely on the trial court's refusal to move the case out of Spencer County. The Supreme Court found that the documented community bias and pervasive pretrial publicity had created an environment where a fair trial was simply impossible. The verdict was not a product of impartial justice, but of a community's righteous and overwhelming fury. This decision is a powerful and often difficult part of the American legal system. The right to a fair trial is absolute, even for those accused of the most horrific crimes. But for the Payne family, this constitutional principle meant their nightmare was starting all over again. Do you believe the court made the right decision, even though it meant more years of pain for Stacy's family? Hit the like button if you believe in the principle of a fair trial for everyone. And let us know in the comments how you feel about this difficult balance between justice and the rights of the accused. The long road back. The Indiana Supreme Court's decision in 2004 was a legal earthquake. For the Payne family, it felt like a betrayal. The verdict they had fought for, the closure they had clung to, was gone, erased by a constitutional principle that felt impossibly cruel. Their nightmare, which had a clear end just moments before, was now a story without a final chapter. The case of Roy Lee Ward was sent back to the beginning, and the long road to justice had to be walked all over again. To comply with the High Court's mandate, the legal battlefield had to be moved far away from the wounded heart of Spencer County. A new judge was appointed, and it was agreed that a new jury would be selected from Clay County, more than 100 miles away, a place untouched by the initial shock and grief that had saturated Ward's first trial. The proceedings themselves would take place in a neutral courtroom in Vanderburgh County. The system was meticulously building a sterile environment, a legal clean room, where the facts could be examined without the overwhelming weight of community fury. As the new trial approached in 2007, the landscape had changed. The evidence against Ward, already overwhelming, had become even more definitive. New, more advanced DNA testing had been conducted. While the first trial showed Stacy's DNA on Ward, the second round of tests confirmed the final damning piece of the puzzle. Roy Ward's DNA was found inside Stacy Payne's body. There was no longer any conceivable path to an acquittal. Facing a mountain of irrefutable forensic and eyewitness evidence, Ward's legal team made a strategic choice. Contesting his guilt was futile. It would only serve to once again expose a jury to the horrific details of the crime before they were asked to decide his fate. So, in 2007, Roy Lee Ward did the one thing he had not done since muttering, "I didn't do anything," on Stacy Payne's front porch 6 years earlier. He confessed. He entered a plea of guilty to the charges of murder and rape. The guilty plea was not an act of conscience, it was an act of survival. It immediately rendered a guilt-phase trial unnecessary and focused the entire legal war on a single question: life or death. The new jury from Clay County would not be asked if he did it. They would only be asked to decide what his punishment should be. The penalty phase began. For the second time, a courtroom listened to the story of July 11, 2001. Prosecutors once again laid out the brutal, methodical nature of the attack. The 18 separate blunt force injuries from the 5-pound dumbbell, the laceration that severed her spine, the final cruel cuts to her abdomen and throat. They reminded the jury that this was not a swift, impulsive act. It was a prolonged assault, and through it all, Stacy was conscious. The defense, in turn, argued for mercy. They presented a narrative of a man with deep-seated psychological issues, labeling him a severe psychopath who lacked a conscience, a man who was broken. They argued that a life spent in a cage without the possibility of parole was a punishment that fit the man, if not the crime. The 12 men and women from Clay County listened to the arguments, weighed the aggravating factors against the mitigating ones, and on May 18, 2007, they returned with their decision. Their recommendation was unanimous. For the second time, a jury of his peers had looked at Roy Lee Ward and the crime he committed, and they recommended death. The judge, bound by their decision, formally imposed the sentence. Justice, it seemed, had once again been delivered. But a death sentence is not an end. It is the beginning of a different kind of legal process, a slow, grinding journey through the state and federal appellate systems, designed to ensure that the ultimate punishment is never carried out in error. For the next 18 years, Roy Ward's case would exist in this legal labyrinth. His guilt was no longer the issue, but the sentence itself was challenged again and again on procedural grounds, on constitutional questions, on the very fairness of the process. In 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court affirmed the new sentence. In 2012, they set an execution date, only to have it stayed by a federal court to allow for more appeals. The case went to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals in 2016, which denied his petition. In 2017, the Supreme Court of the United States declined to even hear the case. For the Payne family, every appeal, every motion, every stay was a reopening of the wound. The years turned into a decade, then nearly 2. The world moved on, but they remained trapped in a legal battle that seemed to have no end in sight. This decades-long appeals process is one of the most debated aspects of the American justice system. Supporters argue it's a vital safeguard against executing an innocent person or someone who had an unfair trial. Opponents argue it creates an agonizing, prolonged trauma for victims' families, denying them the finality the verdict promised. What do you think? Is this lengthy process a necessary part of justice, or does it cause more harm than good? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe this is an important conversation, please hit the like button to help this video reach more people. 839 days. By September 2025, every legal door had closed for Roy Lee Ward. The appeals were exhausted, the motions denied. Only one path remained, a plea for mercy to the Indiana Parole Board. The Clemency hearing, held just weeks before his scheduled execution, became the final stage for 2 profoundly conflicting narratives. On one side, his attorneys painted a picture of a man misunderstood for decades, a man whose true nature was obscured by a disability no one had ever seen. On the other hand, the state of Indiana and the family of Stacy Payne presented the immutable, horrific facts of a crime they argued could never be mitigated by time or claims of transformation. Ward's lawyers built their case around a recent diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder. They argued that the severe psychopath label used by his own defense team in the 2007 trial was a catastrophic misdiagnosis. His inability to express emotion, his flat affect, his difficulty finding the right words. These were not signs of a man without a conscience, they argued, but symptoms of a lifelong, undiagnosed disability. This, they contended, was why he declined to be interviewed by the board. He feared his attempts to say he was sorry would sound fake and not be believed. They presented letters he had written, expressing deep regret and testimony that on death row he had become a kind and generous person. Roy is not a psychopath, his attorney stated plainly. The prosecution countered with brutal simplicity. Deputy Attorney General Tyler Banks called Ward a murderer, a rapist, a predator, and a manipulator, and reminded the board that 24 ordinary Hoosiers on 2 separate juries from 2 different counties had listened to the evidence, and both concluded that his crime was so heinous it warranted the ultimate punishment. The state's presentation was a harrowing return to the events of July 11, 2001, with first responders recounting the horror they found in the Payne family kitchen. But the most powerful voice in the room belonged to Stacy's mother, Julie Winninger. She stood before the board, not just as a grieving mother, but as a woman who had meticulously counted every single day of her loss. "Our family," she said through tears, "has endured emotional devastation for 24 years and 2 months. That is 8 hours, 39 days. She spoke of the empty chairs at family gatherings, of birthdays that were now just sad reminders of all the milestones Stacy would never reach. "Grief doesn't just break our hearts," she explained. "It reshapes who we are, and we don't get to go back. We have to learn to exist in a world without Stacy." Granting clemency, she concluded, would tell the world that Stacy's life didn't matter. The parole board was unanimous, citing the brutal and heinous nature of the crime and the fact that Stacy had been conscious through her final terrifying hours. They recommended that clemency be denied. Governor Mike Braun concurred, and Roy Ward's fate was sealed. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, October 10, 2025, at the Indiana State Prison, the sentence was carried out. Roy Lee Ward, aged 53, was executed by lethal injection and pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. For his last meal, he had a hamburger and fries. His final moments were marked by a strange and tragic confusion. He had prepared a written statement, a final message he wanted his spiritual advisor to read aloud. His last spoken words were a simple instruction: "Brian is going to read them." But for reasons that remain unclear, the statement wasn't read. Hours later, after the execution was complete, his attorneys released the words he had intended for the world to hear. The statement read, in part, "I wish I could go back and change things, but I can't. I hate myself for what I did. If I could take with me every bit of pain I have caused Stacy and her family, I would. There is no excuse. I have asked God for forgiveness, even though I feel I do not deserve it and cannot forgive myself. I hope my execution gives Stacy's family some peace." The man whose lawyers argued he could never find the words had finally written them down, but they were never spoken. The execution of Roy Lee Ward brought a final legal end to a 24-year saga. But the story does not end with him. It ends, as it began, with Stacy. The legal system provided its ultimate answer, but for a family that has lived through 8,039 days of devastation, closure is a complex and deeply personal journey. The case leaves behind a significant legal legacy, with the 2004 Supreme Court reversal standing as a powerful affirmation of the right to a fair trial, no matter how heinous the crime. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was forged, not in a courtroom, but through the grief and determination of the Payne family. After learning of Ward's long history of misdemeanor sex offenses, they channeled their pain into advocacy, successfully campaigning for stricter laws in Indiana to target repeat offenders. Their efforts ensured that Stacy's death would not just be a tragedy, but a catalyst for change, a measure of protection for others. Stacy Payne's life was so much more than its violent end. It was a life of honor, roles, of cheerleading, of music, and of a kindness that, in the end, was cruelly betrayed. Her family's fight for justice and reform has ensured her memory endures not just as a victim, but as a force for good. If you have been moved by her story, please consider learning about or supporting organizations like the National Center for Victims of Crime, which provide resources and advocacy for families like the Paynes. The link is in the description below. Thank you for joining us in telling this important story. If you believe that victim stories deserve to be told with respect, depth, and a commitment to the facts, Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue this work, ensuring that lives like Stacy's are never forgotten.